So thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a idiosyncratic talk on some of the biological changes we're seeing that are consistent with climate change. And it's also a pleasure to speak here in Denver. I've been executive director for about a little over 10 years, and the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab goes back over 80 years. We were founded in 1928, and my perception's always been is that there's been a little bit of a donut hole in terms of awareness of our organization. So there are a lot of people in the rural county, Gunnison County, that we're in that are very aware and supportive of RMBL. The national level, we're very well known, but we haven't always established a presence here at the state level. So it's a pleasure to come here today. Some of the images and some of the things I'm going to talk about are really emphasizing points that earlier speakers have made. There's already been some talk about the loss of glaciers. This is a glacier down in South America, very visible evidence of some of the changes we're experiencing. If we look a little bit closer to home, we're also seeing very dramatic changes. They estimate that we're losing 3,000 square miles of forest to pine beetles. So that's a pretty dramatic change to these ecosystems. Sudden aspen decline. So we're losing aspen to different degrees across the West. So there are pretty significant biological changes going on. Dramatic, often we tend to forget how dramatic they are. This is something that the speaker just before me talked a little bit about. That's dust on snow. So that's Crested Butte and the mountains right behind Crested Butte. And we've seen this deposition of dust. Here's a profile in the snow. So you can see the different layers of snow, different snowstorms, and you can see these are individual dust deposition events. That's another example of a very dramatic change that these ecosystems are experiencing. And as you pointed out, water affects a lot of things. And probably what is one of the more interesting things about this is that dust affects timing of the system. So phenology is a term I'll use several times. Phenology is essentially the science of when things happen. So if you're a plant, when do you flower? When do you set seed? If you're a marmot, when do you emerge from hibernation? When do the robins show up? And that dust changes the color of the snow, and it affects snowmelt. And if you're up at a high altitude ecosystem, as we are, we get about 450 inches of snow a year, it's a very short growing season. If you increase, or if you push earlier the snowmelt date, you can have very dramatic changes on when the snow is gone and when the growing season starts. So these large-scale changes often can have non-intuitive effects on the ecosystems. I like to refer to this as the New Orleans Climate Adaptation Program. And one of the things that I think a lot about when I think about what happened in New Orleans with the flooding is how capable we are as a society of moving beyond fairly catastrophic events, right? So if we went back 10 years ago and said, we're going to reduce one of the major cities in the United States, come close to cutting their population in half. Louisiana lost a seat in Congress and redistricting largely because of this. If you had made these very dire projections, people would have said you're crazy, you're just trying to get people alarmed. Yet, a number of years after that event has faded away, and we tend to forget just how serious it was. And I think that's something that we're going to see in the future. One of the predictions I'm willing to make is that we're probably going to see lots of dramatic changes to these ecosystems, just like we're seeing with pine beetle. And at the time, they're going to be very serious and it can have a big impact. But then we're going to forget, and we're going to move on, for better or worse. So I'm going to talk about the biology of climate change. And I'm not an expert on climate systems and how quickly things are going to warm up and why they're warming up and all the links. But I can talk a little bit about the biology. And it may seem a little obvious about why we would care about the biology, but I thought I would summarize a few points. One, ecosystem services are extremely important to our economic systems. So it's very difficult for economists to get a handle on the value of ecosystem services. There was a well-known paper published by Costanza et al. At the end of the 1990s, and they essentially said if you look at the value, and by ecosystem services I mean how the natural systems regulate water, whether they clean water as a wetlands, the pollination services that they provide for agriculture. They said if you add those up, the value of those ecosystem services is almost on the same level or exceeds the economic traditional systems, right? So we're talking trillions of dollars in terms of economic value to these ecosystem services. So that's one reason biology is important. Another reason that we think about biology is that there are biological controls on climate. So we have the initial forcer of putting carbon into the atmosphere, but then that induces a whole bunch of other effects. And whether you see positive feedbacks or negative feedbacks to dampen those cycles, we now understand that biology plays a very important role in mediating that. So if we want to understand and make long-term projections about climate, we need to understand biology. Aesthetic, those of us who live in Colorado probably already appreciate the aesthetic importance of the environment, why we would care. Political will. I remember 6 or 7 years ago, I had a photographer, an AP photographer, call me up and said, I need a photo of climate change. And I said, well, what kind of delay do you have on your shutter for your camera? But the reality is that a lot of these, when we talk about climate change, we're often talking about very esoteric subjects. Carbon cycles is not something that the general public can necessarily grasp on a visceral level, whereas biological systems, they have pets, they're outside, they experience wildlife, and so when you see changes in that, that's often visceral, and I suspect it's going to be one of the drivers or creators of political will in the long run. The other thing that biological systems do is that they integrate long-term change. So for people that have been interested in water quality, they grasped that fact approximately 20 years ago. They started using insects, stream insects, as an indicator of water quality. And the reason is because if you have a pollution event, someone dumps a bunch of chemicals in the stream, if you're not there to measure what's going on in that stream right after that event, you might miss it. But the bugs reflect what went on, right? Because if you killed all the bugs, even if you can't see the chemical, the bugs are dead and the bugs are gone. And so what the bugs are doing is they're integrating what's happening in that system over long periods of time. And so biological systems in many contexts are integrating all of these different things that are happening. So these are a number of different reasons why we might think about the biology of climate change, even though it's very difficult to link any particular biological event to climate change. I thought before I started talking about some of the research that's done at RMBL, I would reference some classic work that was done 6 or 7 years ago. So there are a couple papers, and there have been a whole series of scientific papers that address the same thing. And typically what they'll do is they'll do a large-scale review and look how biological species are responding and ask whether that's consistent with climate change. So one study published in Nature analyzed 1,700 different species, and they found that they're shifting towards the pole about 6 kilometers. I think that was a decade. Springs moving forward about 2.3 days a decade. And about a fifth or 20% of the species were demonstrating changes that were consistent with climate change. Another study, Terry Root, who's been active with the IPCC, wife of Steve Schneider, who passed away this last summer. Steve was very involved. He was at NCAR, and he's been at Stanford University and was involved with the IPCC on climate change. A study that she published, again, fingerprints of global warming on wild animals and plants. She was looking at where animals are found. And they did a more in-depth study on particular organisms, and they found that 80% of the changes that they were seeing were consistent with climate change, right? So you can take the projections about what's going to be happening to the climate, and you can develop some first-order approximations about how plants and animals should be responding. And if change is just a scatter and it's not being driven by climate, then you would expect half of the changes to go in one direction and half in the other. But what they found is that an overwhelming number of the changes were consistent with climate change. So there are studies like this that take a very broad survey-level approach to looking at biological systems and how they're responding to climate change. And I like to emphasize that knowledge is power. A lot of climate change, it's a political issue, right? At the end of the day, what we decide to do as a society is fundamentally a political issue that's going to be based upon our sort of collective value system. But it's also true that if we were to solve the political problem tomorrow and adopt climate change legislation and reduce our carbon output, we would still experience dramatic and substantial changes to the global ecosystem because there is a lag effect between putting carbon in the atmosphere and how things warm up. So even if we solve this political issue tomorrow, we're still going to be experiencing very different ecosystems, and our children are going to need the information to manage those ecosystems, right? So our children, our grandchildren are going to inherit this world from us, and we're going to give them lots of things, lots of challenges that they're going to inherit from us, but hopefully one of the things we can give them is the knowledge they need to confront those challenges. And so fundamentally, that's what science is about, is generating that knowledge so that they have the information they need to act. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab and some of the specific things we're seeing up in that ecosystem. This is the mountain range just behind the biology laboratory. We're located outside Crested Butte. Gothic was an old abandoned mining town. The biology laboratory was set up in 1928. It was founded on the remains of that old mining town. Here's a map of Colorado. You can see I-70 in orange sort of running in the top part of that, and then we're down below that. And one of the things you might note is that we're a little bit in the middle of nowhere, which I can attest to on a very personal level since I got up this morning at 6 o'clock to drive to this. So we're out really removed from a lot of the main population areas, which gives us an opportunity to look at relatively undisturbed ecosystems, or to look at ecosystems that may be perturbed, but perturbed not because there was a dog rampaging through a research site, but because we're seeing some kind of regional or national scale phenomena going on. This is a picture of the biology laboratory. It's the county road running through the middle of it. We're surrounded by national forest. We own about 300 acres, manage another 1,000 acres for the Nature Conservancy. We have about 45,000 square feet of space that we manage up there. Typically that road, the biology laboratory, is accessible by driving in from mid-May to mid-November. So for about half the year, it's ski in, ski out. What we are is we're a field station that's really a research platform. So you can think of a spaceship going to Mars or a deep sea ocean-going vessel. These are research platforms, and what they are, they provide opportunities for scientists to study particular phenomena. And we host scientists from all over the world. Typically, we'll have people from 15 to 20 different countries. We'll have about 120 different research projects going on at any one time. I try to put that in context because 120 is a small number. It can be a big number depending upon the context. I did my Ph.D. at the University of California, San Diego. We had about 8 scientists working in the ecology and evolutionary biology program. I think Stanford has about 10 in their EEB program. RMBL will have 30 to 40 senior scientists. So we're 3 to 4 times larger in terms of our very specific area of ecology and evolutionary biology than what you would get at a top research institution. So within our niche, we're extremely well known, but it's a very tight, narrow niche. The scientists come from any university or college or nonprofit that's interested in doing research. So we're not affiliated with a particular institution. Rather, we're a research platform they're essentially renting space out on. We've always had a lot of scientists from Stanford University, University of Kansas. There'll typically be 100 institutions represented each summer. We provide facilities. So scientists, and if you think back in 1928, what scientists needed to do field work was very different than what it is today. 80 years ago, it would take people 2 or 3 weeks to come from the East Coast, and they wanted to be there all summer long to study these systems, and so housing was important. Now it's internet and bandwidth, which is a critical part of the physical infrastructure that we provide. We have research laboratories. These are weather ports scientists conduct experiments in. The range of research that's done out there is extremely broad, essentially anything that people might study outside. Pollination biology has been a significant area of research. One of the questions I get a lot, and this is something that, that all field scientists have to deal with, is there is often an assumption that the research that we do is idiosyncratic to that place. So if I was working on molecular biology or I was interested in mechanisms of gene regulation, it wouldn't matter whether I was in Zurich or Mexico City because the results would largely be the same because the mechanisms don't matter, it doesn't matter where you are. Gene regulation works that way. If you're a field biologist and you're working outside, you're working at a location that's idiosyncratic in both time and location. And people will often stop thinking at that point and say, okay, the results that you get mean something only for that particular location. But what a good scientist does is they're able to illuminate the general through an intensive study of the particular. And so what our scientists do is they're able to look in depth at how these idiosyncratic systems work and generate general insight. An example would be there's been work going on butterflies since the early 1960s, and they're using that as a model for evolution. And it turns out that the way those proteins evolve and the genetic systems that control those proteins evolve can be a good model for understanding malaria, sickle cell anemia, and the evolution of those proteins in human disease. So just because scientists work outside in a particular location doesn't mean that the work that they do is not generally relevant. They wrote The Human Population Bomb. If you are interested in population issues, you can even take a step back. One of the scientists that brought Paul and Ann out there was Charles Remington. Charles was a butterfly biologist at Yale who helped get ZPG, zero population growth, going. John Holdren had taught out there for about 20 years. He's currently the National Science Advisor. Theo Colburn lives over in Paonia in Colorado, has spent a number of years in DC, who's highlighted the issue of plastics which mimic endocrine chemicals and disrupt reproductive systems. Theo really got back into academics by taking a class out at RMBL and working with Stan Dotson at the University of Wisconsin, doing her Ph.D. dissertation work there. So the biology of climate change. So I'm going to run through some examples of what we're seeing up there. Here's a photo of the biology laboratory, June 11th, 2004, June 13th, 2001. So any of you who get to spend time up in high altitude ecosystems know that those ecosystems are extremely variable. We can get snow any time of the year. The students who come out to take classes from Hawaii or Samoa or wherever they're coming from, when we get 6 inches of snow on July 4th, it's just, the world has ended. And so we see these kind of dramatic environmental perturbations, and we can talk about high altitude ecosystems as a little bit of canary in the coal mine. They provide us an opportunity to see how the world's changing, and in some context, some instances, we can see biological changes there before we might see them in other ecosystems. One of the things that makes RMBL an interesting place to look at the biology of climate change is that we have a unique collection of long-term studies. So they've been working on avalanche dynamics in that top left-hand corner, going back 30 or 40 years. We have the most complete record of natural avalanches in the world. They've been studying stream insects for over 30 years, sampling those streams. Colorado's non-consumptive in-stream flow rights actually go back to RMBL. Those were established because of the research that was done up there. They've been working on salamanders for 20 years. David Inouye, in the top right corner there, has been studying plant phenology. He's been visiting individual plots going back to '73. So every 3 or 4 days, he and some of his colleagues have visited those spots and kept track of what's flowering. And 40 years ago, 35 years ago, people were wondering what David was doing. But now it turns out that plant flowering time is a very sensitive indicator of what's going on with ecosystems. And so it's not that we have just 1 or 2 interesting long-term data sets, but there's actually an interesting combination and collection of long-term research like that. We have what I call cross-generational collaboration. So if you're interested in long-term data, There are a couple ways to get it. One is you work on something like ice cores, where you can go out with a core and go back 50,000 years and do that within a year or two. That's a very efficient way of doing it. A lot of phenomena that we're interested in, though, there are no long-term records that can be reconstructed. And so the research requires that people go out year after year to collect that data. Though our ability to collect data is expanding dramatically, and scientists are developing ways, interesting ways to reconstruct that don't always require direct observation. You have what I call a loose consortium of scientists. So you have scientists from a lot of different institutions working on the same general subject. Mary Price in the top right-hand corner, University of Arizona, works on pollination. Graham Pike is at the Australian Museum, works on pollination. Alison Brody's at Vermont. James Thompson is at Toronto. Becky Irwin is Dartmouth. Nick Bosser is at Arizona, and Diane Campbell is at University of California, Irvine. And so when you have a group like that that are working in an area, you see a lot of progress quickly. You also have a tight consortium of scientists. So Bobby Pekarsky, who's now at University of Wisconsin, has been working on those streams for close to 40 years, and she brings in colleagues, Gus McIntosh, who's in New Zealand, and Marusha Alvarez at University of Vigo in Spain, Brad Taylor at Dartmouth to work on these streams. And so those kind of data sets build up, and some of the scientists can take advantage of that historical information to look at how the stream insects are evolving in response to climate change. So they're getting to the point where they can actually look at the gene level, how our weather bugs are adapting to warmer streams, which means less dissolved oxygen. Are we seeing changes? So here's a data set that has attracted a lot of attention. And what we have on the bottom axis as you read across is a year. So we're going from 1975 to 2005. And what we're showing up on the y-axis is we're showing the date that the ground first becomes bare from snow melt. What we see is that through time, the snow is melting off a little bit earlier. And because this is a high altitude ecosystem with a very short growing season, it doesn't take lengthening the growing season very long to start to see changes to biological systems. There was a paper published in 2000 that noted that the marmots were coming out 38 days earlier. The American robins, which fly up from Texas and areas south of here, are arriving 2 weeks earlier. So we see that not only do we have earlier snow melt, but the biological systems are responding to that. This shows the date of the first marmot sighting in Gothic, right? If you went back to 1975, if you showed up in mid-May or so, that would be when you would start seeing those whistle pigs, as they like to call them in some areas of western Colorado, showing up. But now you can start seeing them in April. So a fairly dramatic difference. A paper that came out in July that garnered a lot of attention in the New York Times and NPR went back to the marmot research that was done at RMBL. So a scientist, 1961, Ken Armitage at the University of Kansas, started trapping the marmots, collecting a lot of basic information, how many young they would have, how large they were, when they would emerge from hibernation, when they would stop feeding and go in. And what they found was, not surprisingly, based upon the data that I just showed you, that there's earlier emergence. So they're coming out earlier. It means that marmots are eating more, and they're larger when they go back into their burrows at the end of the summer. And so they're more likely to survive, and the population numbers are increasing. And one of the reasons this was interesting is because it was one of the most complete understandings of how a species or population is responding to climate change, are responding to effects consistent with climate change. So there's been a lot of evidence of data where we know that things are changing, but we don't always know why they're changing. And the more we can understand why and the mechanisms, the more predictive power that gives us. And as we see in this example, a lot of this goes back to timing, right? So if all we studied was the number of marmots, we would know maybe there are more marmots. Are there fat marmots? Someone said, well, we should start making fat marmot beer or something like that. super marmots. But a lot of these changes are being mediated by changes in when snow melts and the timing in that annual cycle. And that's probably a general phenomena that we'll see that's true of a lot of other organisms, where a lot of the changes are going to be mediated by these changes in timing. We're also seeing bees move up in elevation. This is unpublished work, but Graham Pike, who's on your left, published a series of papers in the early mid-70s where he did very extensive surveys of bees, and then he came back starting 3 or 4 years ago to repeat those surveys, and what they saw is that the bee populations are found up at slightly higher elevations. And that's sort of the general model that people are thinking about when they're trying to project into the future in terms of how these species are responding to climate change, is that you can substitute elevation or altitude for time. And so as things warm up, it gets warmer higher up, so organisms will move further up to follow that. That's not always true, but it's not only good to sort of have that idea, but it's good to test it to see if it's happening, and the bee data is consistent with that. Mosquitoes are moving up. So this is another paper that hasn't been published yet, but there was some work done again in the early 70s where they surveyed mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are kind of an esoteric subject unless you get bit by one and it happens to be carrying a disease, because they're important vectors for a lot of disease. And that data has indicated that vectors, and I think in fact one of the vectors for West Nile has moved up in elevation to Crested Butte, where historically it was found at lower parts of that basin. So another example of how organisms are responding to climate change in a way that has an impact on health, human health. So I'm going to make another extrapolation here to talk a little bit about some non-intuitive, at least to me it was non-intuitive, though sometimes it takes me a while to catch up, non-intuitive effects of climate change. So here's a meadow. It's Gothic Mountain in the background. Same meadow. Those photos are taken almost the same time of year. And the difference is one of the photos has the aspen sunflower, and the other photo is largely missing the aspen sunflower. So the mechanism, the non-intuitive part of the change, though maybe it makes sense if you start thinking about it, is that one of the effects of earlier snowmelt is that plants are starting to grow earlier. So different plants and different organisms use different cues to decide when they're going to start their annual cycle. Right? So butterflies and insects, some of them use what's called degree days, the number of degrees above 70 degrees. Other plants will use when snow melts off. And the aspen sunflower is doing that. So the aspen sunflower is starting to grow earlier in the year. But our freeze days, so when we get a hard freeze where it drops below freezing, is about the same. So there's a disconnect. Things start growing earlier, but it doesn't mean that our hard freezes are ending earlier. They're coming about the same time. And so what's been happening to the aspen sunflower is that with climate change, ironically, they become more susceptible to freezing events. And this is something that has general applicability because it affects a lot of agricultural systems. Because it turns out that a lot of agricultural systems are susceptible to the same effect. Ironically, we were getting beat up on the Sean Hannity show last spring. And they came over and did an interview outside Mount Crested Butte. And we're trying to explain, and essentially the thesis is that, went back to this idea that RMBL is an old ghost town and the federal government's spending all of this money on studying a ghost town and who cares, so it must be pork, and it's a waste of stimulus money. At the same time that was going on, you couldn't get orange juice, or you were paying a lot in the grocery stores for orange juice because the frops down in Florida were freezing. And for those of you that like to get your cherries from Paonia, probably realize that it's been very difficult to get cherries or even peaches the last 10 years or so because the same phenomenon is happening. The difference with the aspen sunflower is because David Inouye, who's been visiting those plots for 35 years, he knows exactly what's going on, and so he can put together all of the steps and link snowmelt date, when they start growing, freeze events. Whereas when we're looking at the cherries or the peaches or the orange is often we have only scattered anecdotal evidence, even though the results are the same. So we can take studies like this on aspen sunflower, which is a beautiful iconic flower at the higher elevations that has aesthetic value, but we can talk about how what's going on with those illuminates what's happening to agricultural systems. The other thing that scientists are also thinking about are the disruption of pollinator communities. So pollinators are the insects, are the animals that visit plants, and they're providing I guess it's prostitution of the insect world, right? They're providing a sexual service by moving pollen from one flower to another. It's a free ecosystem service that people do pay to bring in bees now, so there is some agricultural value to that. Well, it turns out that pollinators, these insects, often have very different cues for when they come out compared to the plants. And so if there are different abiotic cues and you break the relation to that, you start to disrupt how that community works. And that's something that the scientists are just starting to untangle. They haven't really figured out how it works, and they probably never will. There was a paper that came out last fall that got a lot of press. I think Colorado Public Radio did a nice interview with James Thompson talking about the degradation of pollination services. So they're actually able to show that through time, the ecosystem service that those pollinators have been providing has devalued. Now, I don't think they've managed to work out the exact link, but if you are breaking the relationship between when the insects emerge and when the plants flower, you expect that prediction. You would make that prediction that you would see a degradation of ecosystem services. These effects can push off in ways, so if you have an effect on one organism, it can push into an effect of another organism. The fleabane is a very showy flower, and with decreasing snowpack, we're seeing very similar effects on erigeron or the fleabane as we see in the aspen sunflower, but we can link that to what's going on with the butterflies. So decreasing snowpack, warmer springs, earlier snow melt, still getting frost about the same time, so we're not seeing nearly as much flower production. Well, that butterfly, the adults derive a lot of their adult nutrition from feeding on the nectar of those plants. And you see a decline in that butterfly species that follows about a year or two after a big frost event. So you can actually make the link between these frost events, the impact on a plant species, and the impacts it has on related insects. What does RMBL research tell us about the future? For one, and I haven't talked about this to this point, but biology matters to climate models. One of the experiments that was set up in '91 was an experiment where they've been warming the soil 3 degrees C warmer than the control plots. And the point of that experiment is not to ask whether climate change is happening. That experiment wouldn't tell you that. But it allowed them to explore these feedback effects. So if you warm up the soil, do you see the release of more carbon into the atmosphere, or do you see more carbon going into the soil? Right? So if it's warmer, plants might grow more, and if they grow more, they're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Alternatively, if it's warmer, microbes are more active and they're breaking the carbon down, so it's decaying and it's getting released into the atmosphere. So if you have one effect, you get a positive feedback, put more carbon into the atmosphere, it gets warmer. If you get the other effect, it's a negative feedback, you absorb carbon, it slows things down. And so one of the areas of uncertainty in the biological models, one of the areas of uncertainty in the climate models has to do with the biological responses to increased temperatures. And I think that experiment helped bring some attention to that. Now, this is an instance when you cannot extrapolate from an experiment done in one subalpine meadow to what the biological controls are, but it's an experiment that's now replicated in a number of different places around the world. That particular experiment found that increased temperatures reduce soil carbon stocks. It looks like the pattern might reverse over the longer term, so it kind of gives us ambivalent information, but the take-home is probably the symbolism, which is if we ignore biology, we're still maintaining a lot of uncertainty in our climate change models. That similar experiment has made a very clear prediction that we expect to see the loss of wildflowers up at higher elevations, an increase in woody species. So aspen is sort of that light-colored plant in the background. So when they've run that experiment of increasing temperature, they've seen fewer wildflowers, more of these sage. It's an intuitive result, right? If you think about lower elevations in the basins, the Gunnison Basin, you see a lot of sage. We think of these higher elevations as being very showy wildflowers. And so if this idea that as things get warmer, things move up in elevation is correct, then that would be what we would expect. Ecosystems are changing in complex ways. This isn't a very satisfying answer, but it's the world that we live in. This is a mayfly. So for those of you that might fly fish, might be tuned in to mayflies, might try to mimic them as you tie your flies. It turns out that mayfly populations are sensitive to both water flow and temperature. So the adults will emerge and lay their eggs, and a series of experiments have established that population dynamics can be tied back to both water flow and temperature. And if you disrupt that relationship, so just like I was talking earlier about how insects and plants use different cues for when they do their cycle, if you disrupt the relationship between water flow and temperature, and if you think a little bit about that earlier talk with the dust on snow, where putting dust and changing the albedo can change snowmelt date 50 days, and it's not changing the atmospheric temperature, so you're breaking that relationship between when water is flowing and how warm the atmosphere is. We know that that can have a dramatic impact on the mayfly populations, which serve as a critical food source for fish. We know that making species and site-specific predictions will be extremely difficult. There's a lot of context dependency. Anybody who walks out through the outside world realizes how complex it is and how variable it is. There are multiple pathways of change. So you can have soil moisture be important, temperature be important, snowmelt date be important. Integrating those pieces of information together to make predictions is extremely difficult. Often the results, as at least for me, with the aspen being more susceptible to freezing events because of warmer temperatures, you get non-intuitive results, and you get idiosyncratic results. So what you see in one location does not necessarily apply in another. Increasing variability and correlations of abiotic factors will drive dramatic change. And again, that's just another way of saying that if you have various factors like snowmelt dates, snow flow, when the water is flowing through the streams, if you change the relationship between those things, it's going to change your biological systems in ways that are difficult to understand. As I talk to a lot of biologists who work in these different areas, one of the things that I hear echoes the point that Brad made earlier, and is that it's the multiple stressors that are probably going to cause a lot of the dramatic changes. And so it's not going to be just climate change itself, but it will be climate change interacting with other factors that cause these dramatic changes to the ecosystems. So with the pine beetle and the loss of those forests, there are probably multiple things coming into play. And if we had the luxury of just changing one thing, if the only thing we were doing was changing the temperature, then we wouldn't expect nearly the kind of dramatic changes that we're going to have because we're changing lots of things simultaneously. There was an article in the New Yorker a couple years ago, a butterfly biologist, and he had a quote that always stuck with me, and he said, "It's a wonderful time to be a field biologist. It's a terrible time to be a human being, but as a field biologist, there's a great, grand, global experiment that's being conducted." And he wasn't saying that because he bought into the Michael Crichton idea that money was flowing into field biology because of climate change, because it's not. He was saying it is because we've got this big experiment they're running on ourselves, and that's a very effective way to learn how systems work, even if the end result can be fairly depressing. I'm going to close by emphasizing science and what needs to be done in the future from a scientific perspective. So a book that I recently had come out just this last month, The Ecology of Place, what we take on is this idea of how general insight emerges from studying particular locations. And we went to a number of scientists working across the world, Jim Estes, who's done a lot of work up in the Aleutians, people like that who've been studying these ecosystems over periods of decades, and asked them how general insights emerge. And what we argue is that essentially these ecosystems, like what we have up at RMBL, are model ecosystems. There's an understanding of the importance, at least on some part of the general public, that we need to invest in understanding Drosophila or the mustard plant Arabidopsis, because intensive focus study on a single organism, we're able to put the pieces together in a very efficient way that gives us general insight into systems that matter to humans. And the same is true for ecosystems. Intensive study of single locations allows us to start to weave together these different strands of understanding to get what I think of as a tapestry of understanding about how the world works. So some of these studies that I've referred to today, these are studies that have taken biologists 35, 40 years to put together, and often working in collaboration with someone else who's been working for 30, 45 years. And so a scientist may study one thread of how an ecosystem works, but real understanding only emerges when you start to put those threads together. This is just an example. So I referred earlier, I threw up that cover of Nature, and the point I want to make here is that this approach to science has been successful. So RMBL is probably one of the most productive field stations in the world, and we had the cover of Nature in July, and it's happened multiple times. This is a fun little story. This is a sexually transmitted disease of the plant world. So that plant right there, the yellow flowers, those are actually leaves. That plant has white flowers. There's a fungus that invades the plant and essentially hijacks the plant and makes it look different so that the fungus will get transmitted. So it brings in a whole different set of pollinators that pick up the fungus and move it along. It attracted a lot of attention, and people who are interested in gene regulation and sort of how these organisms work at a very basic sort of metabolic level, that's a study that they can take advantage of to ask a new set of questions. I talked a little bit earlier about the value of ecosystem services. So it's in the order of trillions of dollars, and this is an out-of-date estimate. We invest in environmental biology. So the National Science Foundation is a federal agency that funds basic research in North America, about 2/3 of research in the biological sciences. They invest $130 million in environmental biology. You could say that's a lot, but it's not really that much. The value of pollination to agricultural services is over $200 billion. If we look at American investment priorities, so we have environmental biology over there, $130 million. And I made this slide a couple years ago, and Tiger Woods was thinking about not playing golf that year. They were estimating that the golf would lose about $300 million from him taking a year off, right? And you can use a bunch of, there's no shortage of things that you compare to how much we spend in environmental biology. We spend $16 billion on NASA. And there's a nice chunk of change. I think $1 or $2 billion of that is spent on studying Earth systems. But the reality is a lot of that goes to study other systems. So our investment in environmental biology is essentially zero. Field station and marine laboratories. And I think of these field station marine laboratories as sort of the nucleating, sort of the crystallizing agent where growth tends to expand. Our federal government spends $2 million. We have some donors, private donors, that donate $25,000 a year to RMBL. They're donating the equivalent of what the federal government, 1% of what the federal government spends on field station and marine labs. How we know the world is changing very rapidly. Our world is changing very rapidly. How we know the world is changing very rapidly. This is GeneBank. So GeneBank is an infrastructure tool that scientists use. When they sequence DNA, you're now required to contribute that. It's an extremely powerful tool that scientists are using to explore disease and how disease works, among other things. And on this bottom axis, it's a year. And on the other axis, it's the number of contributions to that. So our ability to track genes and the sequence data was essentially zero until a little over 10 years ago, in which it starts to take off, right? So the way in which we manage information in the biological sciences has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And the same is true of field biology. So we have really some amazing potential in field biology. We can go out and we can measure the location of a spot within millimeters using GPS data from satellites. We've installed weather stations along an elevational gradient. So long term, one of the predictions I'm willing to make is that one of the places in the world where we'll start to make very interesting connections between the climate models and biological systems is here in Colorado, because of the presence of NCAR and RMBL, as well as a number of wonderful scientists working at UC Boulder and Fort Collins at Colorado State. And so establishing infrastructure like this and generating long-term data sets are probably going to be the tools 20 or 30 years from now that people use to establish the linkages. So when they downscale those climate models and they want to figure out what's going on in David Enyue's 2 meter by 2 meter plots with those plants that he's been tracking for 40 or 50 years, we'll be able to establish those linkages. So I'll finish with just a few main points. What I've done today is I've talked a little bit about the fact that our ecosystems are changing dramatically. So if you're a biologist and you look at those systems, you see those changes, and there's no doubt about whether they're happening. It could be simple things. We started seeing ticks up at higher elevations, another vector for disease, whole range of biological, from the very subtle to the very dramatic. We at RMBL have a number of scientists with long-term data sets, and what's unique about that is they're able to go beyond just documenting the changes to actually thinking about why those changes are happening and get at those mechanisms, which gives you some predictive power. And then what I ended on is that we as a society are essentially investing very little in environmental biology. So I think a lot of us think we wake up, we open up the New York Times, or we log on to the New York Times these days, and we read about a lot of the environmental issues. We just assume that there's been investment in studying those issues, when the reality is that we as a society are not spending a lot. And some of those investments don't need to be monetary. There are other things we can do to facilitate that. Okay?
Great. Thank you.
So the question was, will biology provide, if I understand correctly, are there opportunities to use biological systems for sequestration of carbon? Did I catch that correctly? And that's really beyond my expertise. I think Freeman Dyson prompted an exchange in the New York Review of Books, and he was, yeah, and he's been arguing that, that we have capacity to engineer biological systems. And I guess I'm always personally of two minds. One is, for those of you who know Paul Ehrlich, Paul's a very sharp wit, very quick-witted, and one of the analogies that I've heard him use is that free market people are the people they're on the bus going over the cliff. They assume that there'll be a solution that's engineered just in time before the bus hits the ground. And so that's one perspective. The other perspective is that, that there's a lot of, that the world is changing very rapidly in terms of what we can do. I think I've seen studies that indicate we tend to underestimate over a 10-year period the technology that will develop. And so I think the real conundrum is the uncertainty about whether we'll be able to develop those biological systems to sequester carbon. Certainly it will only happen if we invest in the research. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we're going to see pretty substantial cuts into the money that we put into science, and that's where growth comes from, right? I mean, if classic traditional economics, our growth derives from innovation, and I know that if we don't invest in the innovation, there's no chance that we'll come up with the engineering solution. That experiment is probably not going to continue because of cuts to the National Science Foundation budget. So the funding agency is, at this point, looks like it's unlikely that it's a program called Long-Term Research on Environmental Biology. And the funding rates in a lot of our areas in science are getting below 5%. And when that happens, the system's broken because it's essentially a crapshoot. So there's a lot of good science long-term science that doesn't get funded. We've just started last year. We got some funding through the Major Research Instrumentation Program at NSF, and we've started to collect information on dissolved organic carbon. So we've just started to collect that. A lot of the biology that's historically gone on at RMBL is the Northern European model where you count things and you spend all summer counting them, plants and animals. And what we want to do is expand the range of subjects so now you can layer the biogeochemistry on top of the plant biology. And so we don't have long-term data sets, though we're starting to collect that because we realize it's going to be extremely valuable in the future.